Blessed be the Lord my strength, who teaches my hands to war and my fingers to fight.
Saving Private Ryan is the only film that made me walk out of the theatre just to breathe. Not because it was bad, but because it was too real. A US veteran said about the film after a screening in 1998. Many viewers, especially men who had served in the military or who had fathers or grandfathers who went to war, did not watch this film as entertainment. They experienced it as a memory being awakened. Some walked out of the theatre halfway through. Some sat frozen in their seats until the lights came up. Some said, "That wasn't a movie. That was the worst day of my life projected back onto a screen." But what few people know is this: what appeared on screen was not yet the harshest part. Many years later, Tom Hanks only then began to reveal that the D-Day sequence left him with stress reactions similar to someone who had just survived a serious accident. Or that Steven Spielberg forced the cast to live like real soldiers for 10 days, being yelled at, pushed to exhaustion, soaked in cold rain, all for the sole purpose of breaking them down before filming. There were even scenes in which Spielberg used real landing craft, forcing the actors to charge forward, as if there were no way back, no retreat at all. Today, we're reopening the behind-the-scenes story of Saving Private Ryan 1998. 20. Neil Patrick Harris. I almost became Private Ryan. Many years after Saving Private Ryan became one of the greatest war films in cinematic history, Neil Patrick Harris revealed a little-known detail for the first time. He had once been on the shortlist for the role of Private Ryan. Looking back, Neil himself still finds it hard to believe. At the time, his image was closely associated with television theatre and much lighter roles, worlds completely removed from the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy. Back then, everything was still very vague, Neil said. No role was truly locked in. When the script for Saving Private Ryan was still circulating, not only the role of Ryan, but even Captain John Miller had not yet been finalised. Before Tom Hanks was cast, Harrison Ford and Mel Gibson were both discussed. Each name would have resulted in a very different film. For the role of Ryan Edward Norton was the most serious contender, but he turned it down to make American History X. At that point, the list opened up to several unexpected names, and Neil Patrick Harris was one of them. Everything changed when Robin Williams introduced Matt Damon to Steven Spielberg during the production of Good Will Hunting. 2 weeks later, Spielberg called Damon directly and asked, "Do you want to be Private Ryan?" Spielberg wanted Ryan to be an unfamiliar face so the audience would believe he was just an anonymous soldier. But Good Will Hunting was released first, and almost overnight, Damon became a major star. 19. American Veterans. Despite the pain, I'm grateful for the film. After Saving Private Ryan was released, the US Department of Veterans Affairs began to notice an unusual phenomenon. The number of phone calls from World War II veterans spiked sharply within just the first few days of the film's opening. The content of those calls shared a deeply troubling pattern. Many veterans said that the Omaha Beach sequence forced them to relive battlefield memories they believed they had buried for decades. Not because of the plot, but because of the sound design, the editing rhythm, and the way the film placed viewers directly into the position of a soldier waiting to die. According to internal reports, later cited by the New York Times and the Washington Post, some veterans described experiencing familiar PTSD symptoms, again, insomnia, panic attacks, rapid heartbeat, and uncontrollable flashbacks. Some called simply to say that they couldn't breathe after leaving the theatre. One psychologist working with veterans later stated bluntly, "This is one of the rare times cinema has reactivated trauma on such a large scale." The US Department of Veterans Affairs subsequently issued an official advisory urging veterans and their families to consider carefully before watching the film, especially those who had seen combat or had a history of psychological trauma. However, many of those veterans did not reject the film. Instead, they sent messages of thanks saying, "Despite the pain, I'm grateful for the film." 18. A crew member reveals. What you hear isn't a sound effect. If there is one thing that made Saving Private Ryan freeze audiences in place from its opening minutes, it isn't just the images, it's the sound. Many years after the film's release, a member of the sound department finally revealed what audiences at the time could only feel but never truly knew. All the gunfire you hear in the film is real gunfire. According to those directly involved in production, Steven Spielberg rejected the conventional approach used in war films of that era. He did not want gunshots painted in during post-production. He did not want the sound cleaned up or softened to make it easier to listen to. Spielberg wanted every shot to be uncomfortable, sharp and ear-splitting exactly the way it sounded during World War II. So the sound team did something very few films dared to do. They took real weapons, authentic to the period, to firing ranges, and recorded live ammunition being fired. Metal gunpowder and air pressure slammed directly into the microphones. That sound is what led many veterans after watching the film to say, "You can tell immediately." That isn't a movie. That's memory. Spielberg fully understood the weight of that sound and he refused to let it be softened. He requested that theatres not lower the volume even when audiences complained. He even made an unusual demand no one was allowed to enter the theatre after the film had already begun. Because Saving Private Ryan doesn't let audiences hear war. It forces them to be inside it from the very first second. 17. Saving Private Ryan. This film is not here to comfort the audience. Do you remember the moment when the landing craft doors burst open? Seawater rushed in, gunfire tore through the air, and soldiers fell before they even reached the sand. In just those first few seconds, Saving Private Ryan made one thing clear. This film was not made to comfort its audience. When the film premiered in 1998, many theatres across the United States were filled with World War II veterans. They didn't come looking for entertainment but to see a film promoted as authentic. Yet only seconds after the landing craft doors opened, water flooding in and gunfire ripping through the air, the reaction inside theatres went far beyond expectations. According to eyewitness accounts, some audience members sat frozen, gripping the arms of their seats. Others stood up and walked out midway through the screening. Some vomited, some trembled, experiencing panic attacks because what they were hearing and seeing was too close to memories they had tried to bury for decades. Spielberg did not recreate Omaha Beach using familiar cinematic language. He went further. The camera shakes violently, the frame fractures, gunfire slams directly into the ears. Soldiers fall without last words, without farewell speeches. One veteran told the press after a screening in a sentence that silenced the nation, "I saw my friends again. I couldn't stay in that room." Within the first week of release, veterans organisations began issuing warnings, advising those suffering from PTSD to carefully consider whether to watch the film. Some hospitals reported an unusual increase in cases of combat flashbacks. This was no longer an individual reaction, it became a social phenomenon. 16. Tom Hanks. I thought it would be an honour. Do you remember the look in Captain Miller's eyes as he leans against the vehicle, his hand firing the gun almost carelessly from exhaustion, as if every decision he's made is both correct and more than he can bear? That feeling didn't come from a performance negotiated by contract. It came from the way Steven Spielberg invited Tom Hanks into the film. Spielberg simply handed him the script and said nothing. Hanks read it straight through from beginning to end. When he closed the final page, there was no need for further discussion. He said only one sentence, "I thought it would be an honour." On the set of Saving Private Ryan, that feeling never left him. Hanks didn't play Captain Miller as a talkative hero, but as a man carrying a private weight where every order wears him down and every step forward has a cost. Miller doesn't need speeches, he needs restraint. And it's that restraint that makes the character grow heavier with each scene. After the film was completed, Hanks didn't leave the role in the usual way. He continued visiting military hospitals, meeting veterans, and supporting acts of remembrance, maintaining the same quiet, respectful spirit on which the film itself was built. 15. Steven Spielberg's direction. Never let the audience feel safe. Recall the moment when a soldier has just had his bleeding stopped, is still breathing, still alive. And then, in the very next second, as his comrade says, "I got it!" a bullet rips straight through the steel helmet, giving them no second chance. Before the shot, sand is clearly clinging to the helmet. After the shot, the sand on the helmet blasts away, as if violently torn out of reality. And that was not accidental. A member of the editing team later revealed a directive that Steven Spielberg repeated again and again throughout post-production. Never let the audience feel safe. According to people on the crew, Spielberg insisted that moments like this remain in the final cut, even though many felt they were too cruel. He did not want tragedy to be signalled in advance. Because in war, death sends no warning. Tom Hanks later admitted that these were the most grueling and terrifying days of filming in his career. And although most of the scenes were shot in Ireland, Hanks later went to the real Omaha beach, not to research the role, but to walk. He walked from one end of the beach to the other, stopping to read each small memorial plaque scattered along the way. Every name was a story that had ended. Near the far end of the beach, he saw a memorial marker for the unit he portrayed in the film, Charlie Company of the Rangers, mounted on a concrete seawall. According to Hanks, that moment made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, not because he was getting into character, but because he realised the film he had just completed was not imagination. 14. Sizemore. Why him? Do you remember the grimy faces and irritated looks of the squad when they first see Ryan? That discomfort wasn't written into the script. It was prepared long before the cameras rolled. In an interview, Sizemore revealed that before filming, Saving Private Ryan, Steven Spielberg threw the entire cast into 10 days of brutal military boot camp, full gear, bad weather, an exhausting daily schedule. They learned how to carry wounded men, how to move as a unit, how it felt to wake up sore-soaked and still be expected to keep fighting. The goal wasn't discipline. The goal was to break them down, then rebuild them as a team. But one person was not thrown into the mud. Matt Damon was deliberately excluded from the training. Spielberg wanted the others to feel distance. He wanted irritation, jealousy, and exhaustion to set in before they ever met Ryan. Sizemore recalled the moment the squad first saw Damon on set. No one was thinking about brotherhood. The only thing in our heads was one question: why him? That question didn't require acting. It came out naturally because they were genuinely tired, genuinely angry, and genuinely felt it was unfair. Spielberg didn't ask them to perform emotions. He planted real psychology in them before the war on screen even began. 13. Earn this. The line that wasn't in the script. Earn this. That moment when Captain Miller is dying, pulling Ryan in close. No swelling music, no speech. What few people know is that the line was never in the script of Saving Private Ryan. On set, Tom Hanks said it instinctively, like a reflex from a character who had carried too much for too long and was finally placing that weight into someone else's hands. Steven Spielberg heard it and stopped. No second take, no revisions. He knew he had just captured what the entire film had been searching for: its moral axis. From that moment on, the story shifted its centre of gravity. The film no longer asks who survives. It asks, what do you survive for? A small line, but one that presses down on an entire lifetime. Exactly the way many veterans have described the feeling after the war. Not a battlefield speech, just a final request. And precisely because of that, it echoes longer than any gunshot. 12. Crew member. No one dared to look at the rows of headstones for too long. Tom Hanks later admitted in an interview with the BBC that the final scene was one of the very few times he didn't feel like he was acting. According to Hanks, the moment the convoy entered the Normandy American cemetery, no reminders were needed. Voices automatically dropped, footsteps slowed, the usual on-set jokes disappeared completely. It felt like walking into an open-air cathedral, Hanks said. No one wanted to break that silence. The scene was filmed at the real cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. No constructed headstones, no stand-in props. According to the New York Times and American Legion magazine, every cross visible in the frame marks the grave of a real soldier, something Steven Spielberg insisted on keeping, even though it made filming far more complicated and expensive. A crew member later told Vanity Fair that throughout the shoot, almost no one dared to look directly at the rows of headstones for long. Not out of fear, but because of the feeling of standing before something that went beyond cinema. Everyone there understood it. The final scene doesn't feel climactic. It feels like a confrontation between the living and those who never left that beach. 11. Spielberg, one positive test and you're off the film. Do you remember the permanently taut, abrasive face of Sergeant Horvath? The man who always seemed stretched tight between order and chaos within the squad. In real life, that tension was even more real. Years after, Saving Private Ryan Steven Spielberg finally spoke about a decision he himself called the coldest of his directing career. Spielberg knew exactly what he was doing when he cast Tom Sizemore as Sergeant Horvath. He was putting the entire film at serious risk. At the time, Sizemore was known not only for his intense acting ability, but also for a long, unresolved battle with addiction. In a post-production talk, Spielberg recalled calling Sizemore into a private meeting and laying out a single condition daily blood tests. One positive result, and you're off the film. And if necessary, I will reshoot the entire movie with someone else. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a psychological tactic. It was a decision with a contingency plan already in place. Spielberg said that at that point, Saving Private Ryan was no longer just a film project. It was a moral commitment. And if the movie was about discipline, sacrifice, and responsibility, then the people standing in front of the camera could not live in contradiction to those values. Tom Sizemore later admitted that this was the moment he realised no one was going to save him anymore. Every morning before stepping onto set, he had to give blood. And that is why the tension you see on Horvath's face, the eyes that always look ready to explode, the suppressed exhaustion, the sense of constantly standing on the edge of collapse didn't come from acting technique. It came from a man who knew that one slip would mean the entire film would pay the price because of him. 10. The officer. That wasn't technique, that was survival instinct. If you remember the moment when soldiers throw mortar rounds by hand in the middle of chaos, bullets and smoke, you may have thought to yourself, that can't possibly be real. But the truth is, it already happened in real life before Spielberg ever put it on screen. After Saving Private Ryan was released, many people criticised this detail as over-cinematic, arguing that mortar rounds cannot be thrown by hand like grenades. But the problem is this, they forgot history. During World War II, Charles Kelly, an American soldier who was later awarded the Medal of Honor, did exactly that during a battle in Italy in 1943. When his unit was pinned down by heavy fire, Kelly grabbed enemy mortar rounds and threw them back repeatedly to hold the position for his fellow soldiers. That action was not by the book. It was only correct in one situation when there was no other choice. One officer later summed up the incident in a short sentence that wasn't technique. That was survival instinct. Spielberg didn't include this detail to shock the audience. He restored to war its inherent absurdity, a place where people do things they should never have to do simply because if they don't, they die. 9. Robert Rodat. How much does a single life weigh when it's the last thing a family has left? For many years, a large number of viewers believed that Saving Private Ryan was inspired by the Sullivan brothers, 5 brothers who died together during World War II. It was a real tragedy so well known that it became a national symbol in the United States. But the truth is, the film does not tell that story. The real inspiration came from a lesser-known family, the Neland brothers. And the person who directly corrected the biggest misunderstanding surrounding Saving Private Ryan was screenwriter Robert Rodat. In a series of interviews with the Los Angeles Times and the American Film Institute, Rodat confirmed that the film was not based on the Sullivan brothers, saying, "The Sullivans are a national symbol." But if you make a film about them, it becomes a completely different story. According to Rodat, the true inspiration came from a far less discussed case in US military records, the Neland brothers. The Neland family had 4 sons who all enlisted. During a short period in World War II, the army believed that 3 of them had been killed in action on different fronts, leaving only Fritz Neland alive. Under the policy of preserving the sole surviving son, Fritz was ordered to be withdrawn from the front lines and sent back to the United States. The reality was even more complicated. Edward Neland, who was believed to have been killed, was in fact still alive. He had been captured as a prisoner of war in Burma, later escaped, and was found only after Fritz had already left the battlefield. The truth came too late to reverse the decision that had already been made. And Rodat later explained why audiences so often confuse the 2 stories. The 2 stories share the same moral pain, but only one of them allows you to ask the question, how much does a single life weigh when it's the last thing a family has left? 8. Jonathan Shay. This film doesn't depict heroes, it depicts disorientation. After Saving Private Ryan was released, something unusual happened. The US Department of Defense began using the film in PTSD training programs. The person who directly confirmed this was Jonathan Shay, a psychiatrist who worked for many years with American veterans at the US Department of Veterans Affairs, and who also served as an academic advisor to the US Department of Defense on combat trauma. In lectures and professional workshops, Shay repeatedly referenced Saving Private Ryan as a rare example of cinema accurately capturing the neurological experience of the battlefield. Shay explained that after the film's release, several training programs for younger therapists, those who had never been to war, used clips from the film. Especially the D-Day sequence, not as a form of treatment, but as a way to understand. This film does not depict heroes, it depicts disorientation. And that is exactly what PTSD is born from, Shay said. According to him, the biggest challenge in treating PTSD is not technique, but the experiential gap between the therapist and those who have lived through war. Symptoms such as trembling hands, exaggerated, startled responses, prolonged silences, and loss of orientation in crowded spaces are often dismissed as exaggeration, until the viewer witnesses the body reacting before rational thought can intervene, exactly as shown in the film's opening. Shay emphasized that Saving Private Ryan is not used as a therapy. It is used as a doorway to understanding, allowing therapists to believe that war memories do not exist only in stories, but are embedded in the nervous system itself. 7. The studio once feared it too brutal. Do you remember the moment when the theatre lights came back on, but no one stood up right away, as if everyone needed a few extra seconds to return to the real world? When Saving Private Ryan was released in 1998, it didn't explode like a conventional blockbuster. The film climbed slowly, week by week, through word of mouth, through audiences walking out of theatres in silence. By the end of the year, its global box office had surpassed $480 million USD, second only to Armageddon. Within the war genre, it crushed every competitor. But what unsettled Hollywood wasn't the money. It was the reaction. The studio was afraid too brutal. Critics were cautious, too long, too heavy. Some said it outright audiences won't be able to endure it. They were wrong. Audiences kept coming, and they left the theatre unlike how they had entered. Many said they couldn't speak immediately after the film ended. One veteran quoted in the press put it simply, "This isn't a film I watched. This is a film I lived through." 6. Barry Pepper. I took that death home with me. Many years after Saving Private Ryan was released, Barry Pepper, who played the sniper, Jackson, spoke for the first time about something that haunted him for years. Not about sniper technique, not about the brutal shooting schedule, but about the feeling that he had truly killed someone even though he was only acting. Pepper recalled that during the bell tower sniper scenes, Spielberg instructed him not to perform as if he were shooting, but to perform as if he were choosing a specific human being to end. The camera lingered on Pepper's face, allowing the moment of decision to unfold in silence. Steven told me, "Don't think of it as a target. Think of it as a living person," Pepper said. Pepper explained that this direction shattered the boundary between performance and real psychology. When he took aim, he had to imagine a face, a life, and then pull the trigger. And strangely, his body responded as if it were real. After a day of filming those scenes, Pepper returned to his hotel and couldn't sleep. He described the sensation as having crossed a moral line that his mind hadn't yet processed as mere acting. He said it felt as though he had carried that death home with him. Pepper later admitted that this was the first time in his career he truly understood why many veterans say that the memory of killing does not disappear when the gunfire stops. It stays in the way you look at the world in the silences no one else sees. 5. Steven Spielberg. Those steel obstacles didn't just stand there. They forced men to run farther, and every extra second of running meant more deaths. Many years after Saving Private Ryan was released, Steven Spielberg stated plainly in the behind-the-scenes commentary that the X-shaped steel structures seen from the very first scene were not cinematic props, nor were they visual decoration. They were Czech hedgehogs, real metal obstacles that the German army had densely installed along Omaha Beach. Originally designed to stop tanks by 1944, they were repurposed to block Allied landing craft, often combined with mines planted underneath. Spielberg explained that he instructed the design team to reconstruct them at the correct scale, using the correct materials and placing them in historically accurate positions based on wartime reconnaissance photos and military records. But the most important point, according to Spielberg, was not the obstacles themselves, it was the fatal miscalculation behind them. The Germans were convinced that the American forces would land at high tide. In that scenario, the water would conceal the obstacles, causing landing craft to strike the traps and explode close to shore. But the Allies arrived earlier, at low tide. And when the landing ramps dropped, everything was exposed, steel beams protruding from the sand mines laid bare, and a far greater distance between the boats and the shoreline than anyone had planned for. Spielberg said in the commentary, "Those steel obstacles didn't just stand there, they forced men to run farther, and every extra second of running meant more deaths." 4. Spielberg could have walked away with tens of millions, and he said no. With Saving Private Ryan, Steven Spielberg held every major position: director, producer, and global distribution partner. By standard Hollywood practice, profit participation alone would have made him vastly richer than he already was. But he refused all of it. When the studio asked why Spielberg gave a brief answer, I can't take money from a story that was paid for with real blood. He called that compensation blood money. Instead of accepting a paycheck, Spielberg asked that his share be redirected to organizations supporting veterans and the families of fallen soldiers. The transfer was done quietly, without press releases, speeches, or publicity, in keeping with the way the soldiers in the film lived, fought, and died. For Spielberg, Saving Private Ryan was not a product. It was a memorial made of images. And he believed that if they had paid with their lives, then the least he could do was not profit from their sacrifice. 3. A cast member revealed. These things were built to carry men into hell. Do you remember the moment when the boats carried the American soldiers toward Omaha Beach? Those were not models, nor lightweight replicas made for convenience. Steven Spielberg tracked down military records and located 5 real World War II landing craft, including LCVPs, also known as Higgins boats, the exact type used in the Normandy invasion. Most of them were heavily rusted. Some had not touched water for decades. They were hauled out and restored piece by piece, armour plating, welded back on ramps, rebuilt to function smoothly, engines repaired so they could withstand real waves. When the actors stepped onto those boats, they weren't stepping onto a set. They were stepping into history. The cold metal was real. The weight of the vessel was real. And the fear didn't need to be acted. One actor later described the moment just before the ramp dropped. You know exactly what this thing was built for. It was built to carry men into hell. And when the ramp fell and the bullets started flying, even if only for the camera, no one could forget the original purpose of those boats. They were not built to tell stories. They were built to carry people into places they might never return from. 2. Before Fast and Furious. Before the voice of Groot, Vin Diesel was just a waiter. Do you remember the soldier who pauses on the staircase just because of a child? And then the bullet arrives sooner than any words ever could, before becoming a box office star. Vin Diesel lived on tips. By day, he waited tables. By night, he wrote scripts. He wrote, directed, and starred in a short film called Multi-Racial about a mixed-race actor trapped between labels. Diesel maxed out his credit cards to make the film just for the chance to have it screened. Then, something no one expected happened. Steven Spielberg saw the film by chance and invited Diesel into his movie. The role was Private Capazzo in Saving Private Ryan. Limited screen time, no grand introduction. But Spielberg didn't need action, he needed presence. A large, awkward soldier with enough compassion to stop and try to save a child. Just a few minutes on screen, and an unforgettable moment was born. No explanation needed, no swelling music. The bullet arrives the way it does in real life, fast, cold, and without negotiation. 1. When 3 letters arrive at once and a familiar face flashes in pain. In the middle of Saving Private Ryan, there is a very brief scene that leaves viewers choked up, the scene in which condolence letters are written and sent out. The camera doesn't need blood. It doesn't need gunfire. There is only paper, ink, and names written too many times. It is in that moment that the name Ryan is noticed. A woman reading the files hesitates. The camera cuts quickly, and if you look closely, you'll recognize Bryan Cranston appearing briefly as a military officer. No long dialogue. Just a heavy look when he realizes this mother may receive all 3 death notices on the same day. That is not Hollywood dramatization. In real life, it happened to the Neland family. 3 brothers were reported killed within a very short period of time. And more cruelly still, the letter from Fritz, the one who was still alive, arrived on the same day. In that letter, he wrote a simple line that cuts like a knife. My father's Spanish-American war stories will have to take a back seat when I get home. Spielberg placed that line in the film not to explain history, but to frame a mother's pain. A place where war is no longer about heroism, no longer about legend, but about white envelopes stacked on top of one another. So what about you? Which moment from Saving Private Ryan 1998 is the one you remember most? Leave a comment. And if you want to continue unlocking other deleted scenes from Hollywood's golden age, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. You will be surprised by what Hollywood has kept hidden from you for decades.